Lots of interesting things will be happening in the North Carolina General Assembly in 2022, and one of the people who will be playing a key role is the leader of the state Senate, Senator Phil Berger, Republican from Rockingham County. And Senator Berger, another busy and interesting years ahead, I'm sure.
Yeah, interesting probably needs to be defined as a more expressive word than we normally would expect it to be.
What are some of the main things that you're really going to be having to focus on this time?
So I think just like over the past 10, 11 years, the main thing that we need to focus on in the short session is going to be trying to control the growth of government. There are always pressures to do this, do that, add this, expand that. And so those pressures will be felt, particularly given what's happening at the national level with the rate of inflation and how the Biden administration has really made a mess of things. But we actually are looking at a situation where, based on the early numbers, we're going to again overshoot our revenue projections by a large amount. And so we've got to be very careful that we don't use that as a invitation or a temptation to grow the size of government at rates that will create the kinds of problems that we've seen in the past over the course of several years.
You have served in the General Assembly when you've had both ends of the spectrum, one having a lot of money and trying to decide what to use it for, if anything, and then on the other side where you face multi-billion-dollar shortfalls and try to figure out how to cover that. Which is the harder problem to have?
So probably the better problem to have is when you've got extra money. But that's also the harder problem because there are some real consequences to spending all the money that comes in, and those consequences don't manifest themselves immediately. And so you've got to be very careful that you, again, try to keep a cap on how fast you're growing things. Times where revenue is short are certainly difficult and create some real concerns. But as far as the decisions that you have to make, they tend to be pretty straightforward.
One of the nice things for taxpayers is in this last budget, you were able to get back to some of the tax reform things that you had started back in 2013. Individual rates are going down, on a path down even further. Corporate rate is soon going to be starting to go towards zero. That has to be good to see that progression based on the things that you started to work on almost a decade ago.
Absolutely. We wouldn't have the capacity to do those things if we didn't have success in the policies that we have advanced over the past 10 years. And those policies have resulted in just a huge growth in North Carolina's economy. And even at lower tax rates, we continue to see additional dollars coming into the state treasury. And we felt all along that when we have extra money that comes in, that there are basically three things that we ought to do with that extra money. We need to salt some of it away, put it in a rainy day fund. And by the way, our rainy day fund will be at $4.25 billion at the end of the biennium, most we've ever had in our rainy day fund. We need to look at those things at state government that would call for additional expenditures, keeping an eye on how much, but if you have a growing state and if you have an inflation rate, you're going to have to spend more money just to keep things on a fairly level plane. That's the second thing you do. And then the third thing is we need to give some of the money back to the folks that sent the money, and that in the form of tax reductions is the way we have approached. And so again, if we have extra money, we ought to look at those three things. And one of the things that I'm convinced of is as long as our state continues to grow and our state economy continues to grow, we're going to continue to generate more revenue than what we're projecting at the beginning of a fiscal year.
One complicating factor this time around that you don't get every year is new districts, people trying to decide where they're going to be, where they're going to run. How does that affect what the General Assembly actually does when it's in town? I mean, this is something that's at least in the back of people's minds.
Sure, and I think that's the main effect is it's in the back of folks' minds. So people are thinking about I'm thinking about legislators are thinking about what do I need to do now to make sure that I'm complying with what my constituents are expecting of me in the legislature. But then, what about the future? Am I running again? Is there something I need to be doing in order to maximize my effectiveness in terms of being reelected? Those things are thought about, but I don't know that the policies we pursue are necessarily any different in an election year than they are in a non-election year. As long as we have a clear focus on what we want to accomplish, I think it's the same. Good policy is good politics.
Speaking of policy, I do want to ask one major policy thing. A major dividing point between the General Assembly and Governor Cooper has been Medicaid expansion. Part of that last budget deal was setting up this committee that's going to be looking at that and other healthcare issues. What do you hope comes out of that process?
Well, I hope what comes out of that process is some form of consensus as to what we need to do. We've spent the last 10 plus years with just a debate about should we do it, shouldn't we do it. And up to this point, the decision that's been made is that we should not, in North Carolina, expand Medicaid. But the issue keeps coming back. And I do think that the facts from which we need to inform ourselves as to what the appropriate decision would be have changed somewhat. Early on, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not the federal government was going to continue to pay 90% of the cost of Medicaid for the expansion population. And that was a real concern. And that concern would manifest itself in worries about if we expand Medicaid and the federal government backs out, what do we do with the folks that have been promised something, and how does that impact our state budget? Can we afford that? Well, we have had a situation where we've had a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president with a Republican Congress, a Republican president with a Republican Congress, a Republican president with a Democratic Congress, and now we're back to a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, and they've done nothing to modify that 90-10 split on Medicaid expansion. So I believe that the fiscal concerns for the state budget are no longer the concerns that they were initially. Does that change the decision that we make? I think it requires us to take another look at the decisions that we've made over the years, and that's what the commission is going to do. I also believe that if we make the positive decision to expand Medicaid, then that needs to be done in conjunction with a recognition of the impact of putting 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, whatever the number is, of new folks into our healthcare system in terms of having access to their bills being paid. Are we going to generate a situation where we have long wait periods for surgical procedures that need to be done, inability of folks to get to see doctors? And so I think we need to look at some scope of practice issues to expand the availability of medical care, and certificate of need needs to be looked at seriously to, again, expand the availability of the facilities that would be out there that can provide care. If we fail to do those things, I think expanding Medicaid is likely not a good decision. If we are able to find ways to expand access to care, then again, with the fiscal issues not being as paramount as they were at one time, I think it's a little easier for us to go to a positive decision.
We could talk for hours about important issues,
Absolutely.
but your time is valuable. So what do you want people to know about what the General Assembly is going to be up to this year?
Well, primarily that we are concerned about the growth of government. We're concerned about the impact of government on people's individual lives. We are exceedingly and especially concerned about what's happening in the field of education and whether or not parents are able to have the impact on the educational experiences that their children have, whether it's in the larger issue of school choice or whether it's just on the issue of the policies that schools, school boards employ in terms of educating children on reading, in terms of the subjects that children are taught in school, and in terms of how the schools deal with the interaction among children and between children and educators.
Well, we know as the General Assembly is making these important decisions, one of the people who's going to be playing a major role is the leader of the state Senate, Phil Berger, the Republican from Rockingham County. Thanks so much for joining us at the Carolina Liberty Conference.
Thank you.
And we thank you for watching on Carolina Journal.